That was pretty much the story of when we had our defensive failings. It was our one-on-one D. We tried to wait until they caught the ball to defend. We didn't make it difficult for them to pass the ball around.
Stephanie White just stood at a post-game podium, looked directly into the cameras, and blamed her players for a loss that her own coaching decisions manufactured from the opening tip. That is what happened. That is the undeniable, documented on-camera reality of what the Indiana Fever's head coach did after this game. And Caitlin Clark, the most important player this franchise has ever had, the player who carried this offense through 3 quarters while her teammates were invisible, sat somewhere in that locker room and had to absorb the blame for a defensive collapse that Stephanie White designed, deployed, and then refused to own. Welcome back. This is Rim Run, and today we are documenting the moment Stephanie White's accountability crisis became completely, catastrophically undeniable.
That you saw? Well, I think there were multiple. There's when you get layups, 20 points off of turnovers, 17 fast break points. It's our turnovers are killing us. Our turnovers, some of our poor shot selection, they go down the other end, you get a layup.
Let me be entirely clear with you about what is at stake here, because this is bigger than one press conference and bigger than one loss. What Stephanie White did at that podium is a pattern. It is a ruthless, repeating cycle that this coaching staff has been running all season long, and the people who cover this league professionally have been too polite, too comfortable, too embedded in the establishment to say it plainly. So we are going to say it plainly right here. The Indiana Fever have a Caitlin Clark problem. But the problem is not Caitlin Clark. The problem is that the people responsible for building a winning system around the most dynamic offensive player in the WNBA have instead constructed a defensive scheme so catastrophically broken that it puts their own star in foul trouble, bleeds free throw attempts to the opposition at a rate that is genuinely alarming, and then, when the loss arrives, as it inevitably does, the head coach walks to the podium and points the finger at the players, at the one-on-one defense, at the turnovers, at everyone and everything except the strategy she personally drew up and the adjustments she personally refused to make. That cycle ends today. We are pulling every thread. We are laying every receipt on the table. And by the time this video is done, you are going to understand exactly what is wrong in Indiana, exactly who is responsible for it, and exactly why the clock on Stephanie White's tenure is ticking louder than it has ever ticked before. Sit down, take a deep breath, let's go.
It played a big part, and KK was doing a great job on the boards. Her length, she gets deflections, she gets steals, she's active, she's mobile enough to guard multiple positions. She does a really good job of anticipating, and
Here is what actually happened in this game, and I want you to hold every single one of these details in your head simultaneously, because the full picture is the only way to understand how grotesque Stephanie White's post-game comments truly were. The opposing team, the Atlanta Dream, put up 60 points in the paint. 60 in the paint. That number alone is a coaching indictment. That is not a player execution problem. That is a schematic disaster. When a team scores 60 points in the paint against you, it means your defenders were caught in one-on-one situations repeatedly all game long, with no help, no rotations, no second line of defense. The Dream also generated 17 fast break points and 20 points off turnovers. Those 3 categories, paint points, fast break points, and transition points, are the direct and unavoidable consequence of playing pure, helpless, isolated one-on-one defense with no weak side support and no systematic scheme to take away the first pass before the ball ever gets inside. And Stephanie White knows this. She acknowledged it at the podium. She described exactly what happened. Her team waited until offensive players caught the ball before trying to defend them. The feet were already behind. The rotations were not there. The spacing from the opposing offense made those rotations brutally difficult. She described the problem with perfect clarity, and then she turned around and blamed the players for not executing in that impossible situation. She blamed the one-on-one defense. She mentioned turnovers. She talked about poor shot selection. And at no point, not once, not for a single sentence, did Stephanie White look into those cameras and say, "I put my players in a broken system and I did not fix it." That is the accusation. That is the documented, on-camera, her own words accusation. And I am not going to just tell you she said it. I am going to let you hear it directly from her mouth. Don't take my word for it. Here is Stephanie White at the post-game podium, in her own words, describing exactly what went wrong. And notice what she never once says.
That was pretty much the story of when we had our defensive failings. It was our one-on-one D. We tried to wait until they caught the ball to defend. We didn't make it difficult for them to pass the ball around.
She said it. Cameras rolling, full podium, full press corps in the room. We tried to wait until they caught the ball to defend. That is the admission. That is the confession. The head coach of the Indiana Fever just told the entire basketball world that her team's defensive strategy was to wait until the offensive player already had the ball before trying to guard them. And she said it like it was a weather report, like it was just something that happened, like it was not the direct, predictable, catastrophic result of a defensive philosophy that every single person who watches this team has been screaming about for months. Let me say it back to you so you do not miss it. Stephanie White's team waited until offensive players caught the ball before they tried to defend them. That is not a player problem. That is not a Caitlin Clark problem. That is a scheme. That is a choice. That is a coaching decision that was made before the opening tip and never adjusted, never corrected, never challenged. Not even when the Dream was piling up 60 points in the paint and the free throw differential was climbing into ranges that should have triggered an emergency timeout and a complete defensive reset. This is where the outrage has to be precise, because precision is what separates a real accusation from noise. The problem is not that Indiana played one-on-one defense in a single possession. The problem is that Stephanie White deployed pure, helpless, no-rotation one-on-one defense as the foundational scheme for the entire game, watched it get carved apart in real time, made no meaningful adjustments, and then walked to the podium and described the failure as if it were something her players did to her rather than something she did to her players.
That you saw? Well, I think there were multiple. You know, there's when you get layups, 20 points off of turnovers, 17 fast break points. You know, it's our turnovers are killing us. You know, our turnovers, some of our poor shot selection, they go down the other end, you get a layup.
Now let's talk about the tactical specifics, because this is where Stephanie White's coaching decisions go from questionable to genuinely indefensible. The Dream scored 60 points in the paint, 60, and the breakdown Stephanie White herself offered at the podium tells you exactly how it happened. The Dream attacked in multiple ways, not just post-entry passes, not just straight-line drives, but multiple reads, multiple angles, multiple actions that forced Indiana's defenders into impossible one-on-one situations over and over again. And here is the brutal truth about one-on-one defense with no help. It does not matter how talented your individual defenders are. If you send a single player to guard a skilled offensive player with no weak side help, no rotation trigger, no built-in second line of defense, that offensive player is going to get to the rim every single time. It is not a personnel problem. It is a geometry problem. One defender cannot cover every angle. That is why every competent defensive system in basketball, at every level from high school to the NBA Finals, is built around help defense, rotations, and making the ball difficult to move on the perimeter before it ever gets inside. Stephanie White apparently did not get that memo, or she got it and threw it in the trash, because what we watched in this game was the same broken, helpless, no-rotation one-on-one scheme that this team has been running against the Valkyries, against Portland Fire, against team after team all season long. The same scheme, the same result, and the same post-game press conference where the head coach describes the failure in clinical detail and then assigns the blame to everyone except herself. You want to talk about accountability? Here is what accountability looks like. Accountability looks like a head coach standing at a podium and saying, "I put my players in a one-on-one scheme with no help. I did not adjust when it was being exploited. I did not call timeouts to reset the defense. I did not draw up rotations that would have given my defenders a fighting chance." That is accountability. What Stephanie White delivered instead was a masterclass in blame displacement. A carefully worded press conference that named the players, named the turnovers, named the one-on-one defense, and never once pointed the finger at the person who designed and deployed that one-on-one defense in the first place.
Minutes.
It played a big part, and KK was doing a great job on the boards. Her length, she gets deflections, she gets steals, she's active, she's mobile enough to guard multiple positions. You know, she does a really good job of anticipating,
And now we need to talk about Caitlin Clark specifically, because Stephanie White's post-game comments were not just generally evasive. They were specifically surgically aimed at the one player on this roster who deserved the exact opposite of blame. Caitlin Clark carried this offense through the first 3 quarters of this game. While Kelsey Mitchell was a no-show, while Leah Boston was missing layups she should be converting in her sleep, while the supporting cast was doing the absolute bare minimum to justify their roster spots, Caitlin Clark was doing what Caitlin Clark does: creating, distributing, competing, keeping this team alive in a game that the defensive scheme had already decided to lose. And then Stephanie White gets to the podium and floats turnovers as a factor in the loss. Turnovers. As if the turnovers were not at least partially a direct consequence of Caitlin Clark being trapped repeatedly in the fourth quarter, with no viable outlet because the front office and the coaching staff failed to acquire a stretch four who could space the floor and give her somewhere to go. Let me say that again because it is one of the most damning details in this entire story. The Indiana Fever do not have a stretch four. They went and got Monique Billings, a backup, a role player, a solid professional who has no business being on the floor in the final minutes of a close game in the fourth quarter. And so when Caitlin Clark gets trapped in the fourth quarter, when the defense collapses on her and she needs to kick it to a four who can shoot and create space, there is nobody there. The corner player catches it and has no idea what to do with it. The ball goes out of bounds. Turnover. And then Stephanie White stands at the podium and says turnovers are killing us. The turnovers are a symptom. The roster construction is the disease. And Stephanie White, along with Amber Cox, who bears equal responsibility for the personnel decisions that left this team without the floor spacing Caitlin Clark needs to operate, has never once addressed that reality at a podium. Not once. The conversation TV refuses to have is this one. The Indiana Fever are failing Caitlin Clark at the roster construction level, at the scheme level, and at the accountability level, all simultaneously. And the head coach's response to every loss is to describe the symptoms while protecting the disease. There is a second receipt from this same press conference that I need you to hear, because it proves something specific about the way Stephanie White frames these losses. I have been telling you that she buries the real problem inside the language of player failure. And here she is, doing exactly that, on camera, in the same post-game session. Listen to what she says when she is asked about the turnovers and the paint breakdown. Here is the quote. Cameras rolling, full sound, no edit. There it is. Our turnovers are killing us. That is what she said. Not my scheme is killing us. Not my failure to acquire a stretch four is killing us. Not my decision to play pure one-on-one defense with no rotations is killing us. Our turnovers, the players' turnovers, and she connects those turnovers directly to the paint breakdown, as if the turnovers happened in a vacuum, as if they were not the direct downstream consequence of a player being trapped in the fourth quarter with no viable outlet because the system around her was never properly built. That is the second admission. That is the second receipt. And when you put it next to the first one, we tried to wait until they caught the ball to defend. You get the complete picture of Stephanie White's coaching philosophy, which is apparently deploy a helpless defensive scheme, fail to build the roster pieces that would protect your star player in late-game situations, watch the loss arrive as predicted, and then walk to the podium and describe the wreckage in terms that always land on the players. She never points the finger at her staff. She never points the finger at herself. She never addresses the strategic decisions that created the conditions for the failure. She just describes the failure in clinical language and lets the implication hang in the air that the players did not execute. It is a ruthless, deliberate, repeating pattern, and it has been going on all season long. Let's talk about the pattern, because this is not an isolated incident, and I want every single person watching this video to understand that clearly. The same one-on-one defensive scheme that got carved apart in this game is the same scheme that got carved apart against the Valkyries, the same scheme that got carved apart against Portland Fire, the same scheme that has been producing catastrophic paint point totals and alarming free throw differentials against team after team throughout this season. And after every single one of those games, Stephanie White has walked to the podium and described the failure without owning the failure. This is a coaching staff that came in with a reputation. Stephanie White built her credentials at Connecticut. The assistant coaches came in with defensive pedigrees. There was genuine belief, or at least genuine hope, that this staff would install a real defensive system around this roster and give Caitlin Clark the structural support she needs to compete for a championship. What we got instead was a defensive philosophy that amounts to trust your individual players to win their one-on-one battles, and when they don't, describe the results at the podium without adjusting the scheme. There are no zones, there are no mix-ups. There are no defensive wrinkles that force the opposing offense to change what they're doing. It is the same thing the whole game, every game. No adjustments, no changes, no rotations. And when the 60 paint points arrive, as they inevitably do when you play that way, the head coach stands at the podium and talks about turnovers and one-on-one defense as if those are player problems rather than the direct and predictable output of a coaching philosophy that has been failing in plain sight all season long. I want you to sit with that for a second. This is a staff that was supposed to be defensive-minded. This is a staff that was supposed to bring structure and discipline and scheme to a Fever team that desperately needed all three. And what Indiana Fever fans have watched instead is a season full of the same defensive breakdowns, the same paint point totals, the same free throw differential disasters, and the same post-game press conferences where the head coach describes the symptoms and protects the disease. That is the pattern. That is the documented game after game, press conference after press conference pattern that this coaching staff has been running since day one. And now let's talk about the enablers. Because Stephanie White does not operate in a vacuum. She has a coaching staff around her. She has a front office above her. And every single one of those people bears a share of the responsibility for what has been happening to Caitlin Clark in Indiana. Amber Cox is the general manager. Amber Cox is the person responsible for roster construction. And the single most glaring, most catastrophic, most absolutely inexcusable failure of roster construction on this entire team is the absence of a legitimate stretch four. That is not a complicated basketball concept. A stretch four is a power forward who can shoot from the perimeter, who can space the floor, who forces opposing defenses to make a choice between protecting the paint and protecting the three-point line. When you have Caitlin Clark running your offense, a stretch four is not a luxury. It is a necessity. It is the piece that prevents the trap. It is the piece that gives your star player a release valve when the defense collapses on her in the fourth quarter. It is the piece that turns a trap into a corner three instead of a turnover. Amber Cox went and got Monique Billings. Monique Billings is a solid professional. She is a capable backup. She has no business being on the floor in the final minutes of a fourth quarter in a close game. And the reason she is on the floor in those moments is that there is nobody else. There is no stretch four on this roster. There is no player who can catch the ball in the corner in the fourth quarter, look at the defense, and make the right decision with the ball. And so Caitlin Clark gets trapped. The ball goes to the corner player panics, and the ball goes out of bounds. And then Stephanie White talks about turnovers at the podium. This is a failure at every level of the organization. It is a failure of scheme. It is a failure of roster construction. It is a failure of in-game adjustment. And it is an absolute ruthless, soul-crushing failure of leadership. Because a real leader stands at the podium after a loss and says, "I did not give my players what they needed to win this game." A real leader owns the system. A real leader owns the decisions. A real leader does not describe the wreckage and then let the implications settle on the players. Now let me tell you about the cost. The real, specific, documented cost of what this coaching staff and this front office have been doing to Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark is one of the most gifted offensive players this league has ever seen. She can shoot from anywhere on the floor. She can create for teammates at an elite level. She can run an offense with the kind of precision and creativity that comes along once in a generation. And she is doing all of that while playing in a system that is actively working against her. She is running an offense that does not have the floor spacing she needs. She is operating without a reliable stretch four who can catch and shoot when the defense collapses. She is playing behind a defensive scheme that puts her in foul trouble because the referees are watching her guard someone one-on-one with no help. And when she makes contact trying to prevent a layup, she gets called. And then the head coach, the person who designed the one-on-one scheme that created the foul trouble, stands at the podium and talks about defending without fouling. Think about what that means for a moment. Stephanie White deployed a defensive scheme that by its very nature creates foul trouble for her defenders because one-on-one defense with no help forces defenders to make desperate, last-ditch contact to prevent layups. That is the physics of the situation. When you have no help defense, your on-ball defender is the last line of defense. When the offensive player beats them off the dribble, the only options are foul or give up a layup. Stephanie White chose the scheme that creates that situation. And then she stood at the podium and said, "We need to defend without fouling." Caitlin Clark is being asked to be the best player on this team, the best offensive creator on this team, and a one-on-one stopper in a scheme with no help, all simultaneously. And when the math does not work out, the head coach describes the failure at the podium in language that puts it on the players. That is the cost. That is what Caitlin Clark is absorbing every single game while this coaching staff collects their paychecks and refuses to own the decisions that are making her job impossible. And here is the third and most damning receipt from this press conference. Because after everything we just walked through, after the 60 paint points, after the one-on-one scheme, after the foul trouble, after the fourth quarter trap with no stretch four to kick it to, Stephanie White was asked a direct question about closing the game with a specific player, and I want you to hear exactly how she answered it, because this is the moment where the accountability failure becomes completely, mathematically undeniable. This is the clip that nobody on television will play for you in full, because of what it proves about the way this coaching staff operates. Here is Stephanie White, in her own words, describing a late-game decision. Let me say it back to you so you do not miss it. She praised the player she chose to close with. She talked about length, deflections, steals, mobility, anticipating. She gave a full endorsement of the player she trusted in the final minutes. And at no point in that answer did she acknowledge that the player she was describing as a closer, a young, developing player who is still learning the game at this level, was on the floor in that situation because the roster was never built to give Caitlin Clark a legitimate stretch four to play alongside. The praise for the player she used is real. The silence about why that player was necessary is the indictment. This is how Stephanie White operates at the podium. She answers the question that was asked. She says something technically accurate and occasionally even generous about her players, and she never ever volunteers the information that would implicate her own decisions. She never says, I put this young player in a closing situation because Amber Cox and I failed to acquire the stretch four that would have made this lineup functional. She just talks about length and deflections and gives the young player a compliment and moves on. And the real story, the story about the roster gap, the scheme gap, the accountability gap, never gets told. That is the conversation TV refuses to have. That is the part of the story the press conference skipped. And that is exactly why we are here, doing this right now. So where does this leave us? What is the honest, clear-eyed verdict on Stephanie White's tenure in Indiana, and what has to happen next? Here is what I believe, based on everything documented in this video. Stephanie White is not a bad person. She is a basketball coach who came into a situation with real talent and real potential, and has been unable to build the defensive system that this roster needs, unable to make in-game adjustments when her scheme is being exploited, and unable or unwilling to stand at a podium after a loss and own the decisions that led to it. Those three failures, taken together, make her the wrong coach for this moment. They make her the wrong coach for Caitlin Clark, and they make the current situation in Indiana unsustainable. The defensive scheme is not going to fix itself. Stephanie White has been running the same one-on-one, no-help, no-rotation defense against team after team all season long, and the results have been the same every time. 60 points in the paint, alarming free throw differentials, foul trouble for her best players, and post-game press conferences where the scheme is described and the players are implicated and the coaching staff walks away clean. That cycle does not break without a fundamental change in approach, and there is no evidence from any game this season that Stephanie White is capable of making that fundamental change. The roster construction problem is not going to fix itself either. Amber Cox made the decision to build this roster without a legitimate stretch four, and that decision is costing Caitlin Clark in real time every single game in the fourth quarter, when the trap comes and there is nobody to kick it to. That is a front office failure that compounds the coaching failure, and both of them are being paid for by the same person, the player who is doing everything right and absorbing all the blame. Let me tell you what I predict is going to happen next, because the pattern here is clear enough that the predictions are not complicated. First prediction. Stephanie White is going to coach another game with the same defensive scheme. She is going to deploy the same one-on-one, no-help, no-rotation approach that has been producing catastrophic paint point totals all season. The opposing offense is going to exploit it the same way every opposing offense has been exploiting it. The free throw differential is going to climb into the 20s and 30s again. And after the game, Stephanie White is going to walk to the podium and describe the failure in clinical language and talk about turnovers and one-on-one defense and defending without fouling. That is prediction 1. I am not going out on a limb. I am describing a documented pattern. Second prediction. Caitlin Clark is going to keep competing at an elite level despite the system working against her. She is going to keep creating, keep distributing, keep finding ways to generate offense in a structure that does not give her the floor spacing she needs. She is going to keep doing this because that is who she is, a competitor who does not quit, who does not make excuses, who shows up every single night and tries to win regardless of what the scheme looks like, or what the roster construction looks like, or what the head coach says at the podium after the loss. Caitlin Clark is going to keep being Caitlin Clark. The question is how long this organization is going to keep making her do it alone. Third prediction. The pressure on this coaching staff is going to keep building. The losses are going to keep coming. The paint point totals are going to keep being catastrophic. The post-game press conferences are going to keep being evasive. And at some point, whether it is this season or the offseason, the Indiana Fever are going to have to make a decision about whether this coaching staff is the right group to build a championship around the most important player this franchise has ever had. And here is the fourth prediction, and this is the one that matters most. When that decision gets made, the receipts are going to be right here. The 60 paint points, the one-on-one scheme, the we tried to wait until they caught the ball to defend, the turnover speech, the fourth quarter trap with no stretch four. All of it, documented, time-stamped on camera. The accountability that Stephanie White refuses to take at the podium is going to be assigned to her by the results, because the results do not lie and the results do not have a press conference. Caitlin Clark is playing right now, tonight, tomorrow, next week. She is competing in a broken system with a head coach who will not own her decisions, a roster that was not built to protect her in late-game situations, and a defensive scheme that puts her in foul trouble and then blames her for fouling. She is doing all of that and she is still competing, still creating, still being the player this franchise desperately needs her to be. That is not a small thing. That is not something to take for granted. That is a player absorbing an absolute catastrophic, soul-crushing organizational failure at every level, scheme, roster, accountability, and still showing up and competing because the alternative is quitting, and Caitlin Clark does not quit. The Indiana Fever do not deserve that kind of competitor right now. Not with this coaching staff. Not with this defensive scheme, not with this approach to post-game accountability. They do not deserve her, and every single person who watches this team knows it. Stephanie White, blamed. The players, after designing the scheme that made the loss inevitable. That is the story. That is the documented, on-camera, her own words story. And it is absolutely disgusting. Here is the forced choice question for the comments section, and I want real answers. Is Stephanie White the right coach to build around Caitlin Clark? Yes or no? Not she needs more time, not the roster is the problem. Yes or no? Is she the right coach? Drop it below. Let's have the conversation that TV refuses to have. If this video told you something you needed to hear, hit that like button right now. It is the single fastest way to make sure this content keeps reaching people who care about this team and this player. Subscribe to Rim Run and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video, because we are going to keep documenting exactly what is happening in Indiana for as long as it keeps happening. Share this one with every Fever fan you know. The receipts are right here. The conversation starts now.